You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology. And this is This Week in Cardiology for August 20th, 2021. This week, COVID, Simpson's paradox, left atrial appendage closure, multimorbidity, and an ESC preview. The COVID situation continues to be focally quite bad. Hospitalizations in some areas have risen to the point where many places are postponing elective procedures. We're close to that, but not quite there. But I'm going to focus on some mildly optimistic signs. First, states that were first hit seem to have seen cases peak. Look at the curves for Missouri and Louisiana and even Texas. The 7-day moving averages have flattened. I hope that's a good sign. Now, while the world would have been better off without this virus, for sure, I want to highlight 3 positive aspects of the current situation. One positive has been the pressure to do same-day discharges after procedures. This has forced many of us, me included, to break out of our dogma that overnight hospital stays were necessary. Jason Andrade from the University of British Columbia has published on the feasibility of same-day discharge after AF ablation, and the COVID situation now has sped translation of this work, and I think it's a good thing. Another positive, vaccine efficacy is held up beautifully. While you've all heard of the rare breakthrough cases, the vast majority of severe COVID continues to occur in the unvaccinated. And given the near certainty that SARS-CoV-2 will become endemic, the main outcome measure now seems to me no longer cases, but hospitalizations. Another positive, the increase in cases has taught 2 important statistical lessons. And any time statistical lessons reach the public, the world becomes a better place. That's because numerical illiteracy drives a lot of terrible decisions. Now, the first lesson is the base rate phenomenon. We've learned that in states or countries that have high vaccination rates, most of the new cases of COVID occur in vaccinated individuals. Of course they do. I mean, even with excellent vaccine efficacy, there are much higher absolute numbers of vaccinated people than unvaccinated. The second lesson is Simpson's paradox, where it is possible to draw 2 opposite conclusions from the same data, and that depends on how you divide the data up. Or another way of saying it, a trend or result is present when the data is put into groups that reverses when the data is combined. Now, a paper from Israel got a lot of attention because it purported to show reduced vaccine efficacy against severe COVID. I'm going to link to an excellent explanation from UPenn professor Jeffrey Morris. The absolute number of severe cases was reported as 214 per 100,000 among non-vaccinated and 301 per 100K in fully vaccinated. Now that's almost the same. That looks quite bad. But there are 2 lurking variables. One is the base rate of unvaccinated versus vaccinated. There were 1.3 million unvaccinated, but 5.6 million vaccinated people in Israel. So now, if you adjust for that base rate, it ends up being 16.4 per 100,000 in the unvaccinated versus 5.3 severe cases per 100,000 in the vaccinated individuals. So that's much better vaccine efficacy at 67% when you adjust by the base rate. But wait, you have heard vaccine efficacy with Pfizer, especially for severe disease, is supposed to be greater than 90%. What gives with only 67%? Perhaps it's the Delta variant. No. No, there are more lurking variables. Recall that the vast majority of older people in Israel are vaccinated, while only 73% of younger folks are vaccinated. It turns out that actually 85% of the unvaccinated group are younger, defined as age less than 50. But also remember the age grading of COVID. Older people are much more likely to get severe COVID, which is another lurking variable. So now, if you break out the vaccine efficacy by age groups, you can compute the vaccine efficacy for severe disease for each age group. In younger people, the number of severe cases was 13x more likely in the unvaccinated. That translates to a vaccine efficacy of 92%. In older folks, the number of severe cases was 7x more likely in the unvaccinated. Vaccine efficacy there, 85%. So, indeed, the vaccine holds up well against Delta. The paradox here occurs because of the fact that both vaccination status and risk of severe disease are systematically higher in the older age group. Now, to be sure, there may be other variables such as the early versus late vaccination, but my main point here is not so much about vaccine efficacy. But my main point is that observational data is super complicated. When you randomize, you tend to balance both known and unknown variables. Observational data, though, requires thinking carefully about all the potential lurking variables. Whenever I see an observational paper that makes big conclusions, I pause and think, well, this is going to require going slowly and looking hard at the methods. My friends, understanding things like base rate and Simpson paradox are important because it inoculates you against being bamboozled by dubious scientific conclusions. And I'll put in some other links on Simpson's paradox, and I just am fascinated by it. Next topic is left atrial appendage occlusion. There are two stories to discuss this week on appendage occlusion. The first is that the FDA has given approval for the Amulet device. This is made by Abbott. It's a percutaneous appendage occlusion device that is different in design than Watchman. It's the same idea, though. It's mechanical stroke prevention. It's been used in Europe for many years, and it's quite popular there. What's weird about this approval is that it was based on the Amulet IDE trial, which is to be presented next weekend at ESC. Now, I'm sure the FDA has seen the data before we have, but we'll see. The Amulet IDE study compares Amulet directly with Watchman. It had 3 primary endpoints: a composite safety endpoint, an ischemic stroke and systemic embolism efficacy endpoint, and a device closure endpoint looking at the efficacy of device closure with transesophageal echo. Now, each of these 3 endpoints were tested with non-inferiority designs, and I think we're going to have to see the data. But I'm concerned that non-inferiority was used in all these endpoints. I mean, would we not want a device that was better, superior in some way? We will have to wait and see what kind of data is presented at ESC. And finally, I would have loved to have seen a third arm in this trial. What a huge thing this would have been. Imagine a non-procedural arm, Watchman, Amulet, conventional therapy. That would have taught us so much. The medical arm, for instance, would have had 0 upfront procedural complications. The second study, Jack Interventions, published the second Watchman study. First author, Kirit Ahuja, sorry for the mispronunciation. Along with co-authors, they used a nationwide readmissions database to study the association between kidney disease, chronic kidney disease, and end-stage renal disease with in-hospital and short-term outcomes in patients who had appendage closure. The retrospective observational study included 21,000 patients who were broken up into 3 groups. About 16,000 patients had appendage closure and did not have kidney disease. About 4,000 had appendage closure who had CKD, and 570 patients who had appendage closure and end-stage renal disease. Now, the findings were not surprising. Patients with end-stage renal disease were 6.5 times more likely to die in the hospital after left atrial appendage closure than those without end-stage renal disease. The confidence intervals ranged from 3.3 to 12x higher risk of death. The absolute in-hospital death rate in patients who had left atrial appendage closure and end-stage renal disease was 3.3%. It's pretty high. CKD was associated with an increased risk for in-hospital acute kidney injury or hemodialysis and stroke or TIA. End-stage renal disease and CKD were both associated with increased readmissions, extending to 90 days compared with no CKD. And while there are wide confidence intervals and the definition of CKD is fluid, the general trends here highlight the added risk of harm incurred by patients with CKD when they have left atrial appendage closure. I think this is a good use of registry data. It reinforces that the net benefit calculus of this preventive procedure differs greatly in patients with kidney disease. A patient considering left atrial appendage closure must believe that the added benefits of having the appendage plugged and maybe not being on oral anticoagulation must be greater than the risk of a major adverse events from the procedure ranging from 3 to 9%. But if you have advanced kidney disease, what this study shows is that baseline risk of 3 to 9% is actually 3 to 12x greater, which is a huge increase. And consider also that patients with CKD have many other competing causes of cardiovascular events. Perhaps the biggest problem with recommending this procedure to patients with advanced kidney disease is that we don't even have any idea, literally no idea, whether anticoagulation is a net benefit in the first place. And this, of course, is because so few patients with advanced kidney disease were randomized in the pivotal anticoagulation trials. And observational studies in patients with kidney disease go both ways. Some observe fewer strokes with anticoagulation, others observe more bleeding, but of course, all observational studies are heavily confounded. Even if I were a left atrial appendage closure proponent, I'm not, but if I were, I would not recommend it for patients with advanced kidney disease. And the lesson here about multimorbidity transcends left atrial appendage closure. There's an analogous story with CKD and ICD placements. Now, in ICDs, there's no trial-level evidence showing that preventive ICDs improve mortality in patients with chronic kidney disease. First, patients with severe chronic kidney disease were not included in the pivotal clinical trials. Second, even when you look at patients from the clinical trials with mild to moderate CKD, there was no ICD benefit. And finally, the ICD-2 trial of preventive ICDs versus medical therapy in patients with end-stage renal disease was stopped for futility, and I'll link to that trial. The obvious reason preventive therapies struggle in patients with severe multimorbidity is that there is a higher upfront risk of the procedure and tons more competing causes of bad outcomes. Always consider multimorbidity when you're thinking about preventive procedures. The final topic today is an ESC Preview. I'll have a preview column up next week, and journalist Steve Stiles will also have a preview, and Steve's previews are comprehensive and excellent, so take a look at that. Now, here are a couple of the studies that I'm looking forward to. And of course, the big one for this year's virtual meeting will be the Emperor Preserve trial, which compared to sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitor empagliflozin to placebo in approximately 6,000 patients with heart failure and a preserved ejection fraction. And this trial may be the biggest trial of 2021. And we already know from a company press release that the trial met its primary endpoint of CV death or hospital admissions for heart failure. But my friends, the question to be answered from the ESC meeting is whether statistical significance translates to value and clinical significance. And clinical significance will turn on critical appraisal. For instance, how robust was the reduction in outcomes? Now, everyone should shun arbitrary p-value cutoffs, but a p-value of 0.001 is going to be more robust than 0.04. But more important than the p-value, I think, is the effect size of the benefit. I'm looking for the absolute risk reduction and whether the primary endpoint was driven by CV death or the softer endpoint of heart failure hospitalizations. Also, do the subgroups here give us a clue to which type of patient may benefit more or less from the drug? When considering value, consider two extreme examples. A low-value case would be if empagliflozin barely reaches statistical significance, the primary endpoint is driven by only modest absolute reductions in heart failure hospitalizations with no reductions in CV death and no overall mortality benefit. But a high-value case for the drug would require a robust statistical result, reductions in both CV death and heart failure hospitalizations, as well as lower overall mortality, and we'll just have to see what the results are. A second trial at ESC really excites me, and this is on AF screening, and you all know that I've been a skeptic of AF screening. In fact, I'm a skeptic of any screening. But thus far, it's true that digital devices have delivered far more information than knowledge. I mean, we can easily detect minutes to hours of asymptomatic AFib on watches, on cardiac monitors, pacemakers. But then what? I always get this question, Mandrola, my 70-year-old patient has 1 hour of AFib. Should I start an anticoagulant? And for how long? For life? For 1 hour of AFib? The LOOP study from Copenhagen will randomize about 6,000 patients older than 70 who have one risk factor to AF screening with an implantable cardiac monitor or usual care. And implantable cardiac monitors are pretty good for picking up AFib. The randomization is 4,500 patients in the ICM arm and 1,500 in the control arm. Now, this trial excites me because the primary outcome is the time to first stroke or systemic embolism, a hard endpoint. This differs from the many previous AFib screening trials which have consistently shown that AF screening of any type leads to more detection of AFib and more use of anticoagulation. But those are surrogate measures. The question we want to know is the net benefit of treating these episodes. I mean, starting anticoagulants for short duration AFib is considered a good thing, but we don't actually know if it will deliver more benefit in terms of stroke reduction than harm in terms of bleeding. And the first step in showing any net benefit is does all the added anticoagulation from AF screening significantly reduce stroke in the first place? The active arm of the LOOP protocol calls for anticoagulation for any detected AF more than 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That's a very low bar, so lots more patients in the active arm will likely be on anticoagulation. If LOOP shows a reduction in stroke, the next question will be at what cost? In the trial protocol, major bleeding is listed as an quote-unquote other outcome, but I see it as a key secondary outcome. Due to time constraints, these are just two of the many studies at ESC that I'm looking forward to. My column will include more studies, as will Steve Stiles' column, even more than that. ESC begins on Friday, and look for coverage from theheart.org and Medscape Cardiology. So that's it for this week in cardiology, and as always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, my friends, if you like this podcast, please consider taking the time to give us a rating, writing us a sentence or two review. These things really help others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. By the way, that anticoagulation in COVID-19 trial is one of the hardest I have seen in years. I'm still working on it, so stay tuned.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.